Okay, now we're started. Okay, so a quick note on the midterm. There was a mistake on I had a file from the previous year, went up with the notes to D2L, and I think that said that the midterm was even tomorrow. It's not. It's the 15th of October, so anybody who panics and started studying, good on you. Anybody who is just hearing about this now, you need to pay more attention to the lecture. Okay, so today I'm going to talk a bit about, it's kind of an interesting lecture, it sort of changes focus a little bit. And rather than talking about the species that are interacting and how species interact, or about how the environment influences how species interact, we're going to talk about the actual energy and how food webs are fueled. How energy moves up through a food web and gets to our consumers, where that energy comes from. And when it's not typically the way it's not regularly the way we look at ecological questions or look at ecological environments. But what we're getting to is the connectivity within a system. And these are some sort of guidelines or guiding lights from F.A. Bazaz, who was a plant physiologist, a very eminent professor in Harvard up to a couple of years ago. Saying everything is connected to everything else, everything must go somewhere, and there's no such thing as a free lunch. And we could sort of see them as our guiding principles as we go through the rest of this lecture. So from an ecological perspective, all organisms require energy. They require energy to fuel their growth, to develop their gonads, for movement. But that energy has to come from somewhere. So for all these organisms, there has to be a source of energy, somewhere where they obtain their energy, either directly through the sun or by consuming other organisms. And also there's a loss of usable energy, as we'll see at each at each stage. If you go through each reaction, there's some amount of energy is lost. So to understand this, we need to go back to some sort of just a quick recap on some very basic physics before we power into the ecological interpretation of this. When we talk about energy, there's sort of two main forms. We have potential energy, which is stored energy, which can be released, and kinetic energy, which is the active energy. You can see a sort of example from a diver here who's poised, ready to go. All that energy is built up within his body. And here it's being very dramatically released in kinetic energy. Energy flow in an ecological system, like all energy, follows the laws of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics, that energy is neither created nor destroyed. And within a system, there will be no gain or loss in the total energy. So this example from a fire. There's energy here, potential energy stored within the wood, and as that's been released in the fire, it's also giving out heat energy. So the materials decrease, but the amount of energy within the system remains. It's transferred from potential energy within the wood into heat energy and expended in the environment. Within the ecological component, we've got two types of chemical reactions. Exothermic reactions, where heat energy is lost from the system, or endothermic reactions, where energy is absorbed into a system. And there's a nice example of this in sugars and plants, particularly things like sugar cane or sugar beets. And sugars are quite a complex chemical, and if we look at the chemical composition within the sugars, it's greater than the sum of the physical components, because once we've got photosynthetic plants, there's the additional energy is extracted through photosynthesis. So the amount of energy in the growing plant exceeds the amount of energy solely from its physical environment, from the nutrients that it took in. The second law of thermodynamics. Two sort of components here that will sort of follow through. The transformations of energy always result in some loss or dissipation of energy. So in the case of the fire, there's energy, there's heat energy is lost as we go through that reaction. Within a closed system, the potential energy of the final state will be less than that of the initial state. Again, we can take this from the analogy of a fire. If you had a campfire, you start off with a lot of wood, you burn that, it gives off heat. You come back the next morning to see your campfire, and there's sort of charred remaining. That's what you can burn. You've got charcoal, things like that. In the right conditions, you can burn that. But the energy, the potential energy in what's left is lower than the potential energy in what you started with. Because we've lost a lot of that heat energy, we've given out a lot of energy. We can phrase this as entropy, as an increase in entropy. And entropy is the amount of unavailable energy within a system, energy which has been lost. And entropy will always increase within a system. We need to apply energy to something to give it structure. So we can look at sort of examples of this in a combustion engine. Typical engine was around about, it can use up, or it's 25% efficient in its transfer of chemical energy to motion and kinetic energy within a car. Entropy, we start with in this case, a child's room, or it could be a dorm room. Energy has been put in to order this room, to organize books on shelves, to get everything in a neat structure. But over time, that will break down by the activity of having a small person or even a larger person in this room. That structure breaks down, and this is what we see as an increase in entropy, an increase in unavailable energy within the system. Bringing this into ecological conversation, an ecological setting, we've talked a bit about a variety of food webs, and we've talked a bit about a variety of different types of food webs, from a marine to a freshwater. We'll talk later on about rivers and lakes, difference between rivers and lakes. But all of these food webs, whatever habitat they're occurring in, have a very similar structure. They begin with sunlight fueling primary producers, and that is transferred, that energy in primary producers is transferred to consumers and also to decomposers. And at each step of this, we lose energy. Some energy is lost, typically in the form of heat. There's different forms of primary production. Primary production, at its essence, is the rate at which any autotroph can convert carbon dioxide, be that in the CO2 in the water or in the atmosphere or in water, into an organic compound. And there's different ways that organisms do this. What we're most familiar with is photoautotrophs. So any plants or algae which can use power from the sunlight or energy from the sunlight to convert CO2 into their own tissue, into an organic compound. There's also a wide variety of chemoautotrophs, typically just of bacteria, which can also convert or create organic matter organic compounds by oxidizing other chemical compounds. And quite often these will be either nitrogen oxidizing bacteria or sulfur oxidizing bacteria. I talked a little bit, or alluded to in a previous lecture, about food webs that build up around deep sea vents. And that depth is far beyond any depth that sunlight reaches. But those food webs are fueled by sulfur oxidizing bacteria, a different form of primary production. But once you've got the primary production, everything else follows suit. When we think of primary production, it's really useful for ecologists to be able to measure this and understand the amount of production within a system and how that energy is transferred through a system. To do that, we need to at first understand what we're talking about in terms of available energy and the amount of production. We've got two sort of measurements. So first is gross primary productivity, and that's the total rate of production by autotrophs. And that could be photoautotrophs or chemoautotrophs. The net primary productivity is then the rate of that energy storage minus energy lost through respiration. So in order to photosynthesize or in order to oxidize those chemicals, these organisms have to be active. And when they're active, they're burning oxygen. They're expending energy. So we've got two rates. We've got the gross primary rate and the net primary rate, or the net primary productivity rate, or NPP. We can sort of think of this, or display this experimentally. So for an aquatic ecologist, somebody like me, we can measure productivity by measuring oxygen. We can measure the amount of oxygen within a body of water, because we know that as the plants are photosynthesizing, they're producing oxygen. So oxygen is a nice correlate of productivity. So if we set up an experiment simply with a beaker or a bottle of a clear bottle filled with water and some plankton, put that in an illuminated area to stimulate photosynthesis, we can measure the amount of oxygen, how the oxygen in that changes over time. And what we'd see is a steady increase in oxygen as illuminated, stimulating photosynthesis. At the same time, the photoautotrophs are respiring and are burning up oxygen. So the amount of oxygen that we're measuring in that bottle over time is a net primary productivity, because we're measuring the amount of oxygen that's been produced minus the amount of oxygen that's being consumed. If we want to bring that up to estimate the actual gross primary productivity, we need to get a measure solely of the amount of oxygen that's being lost through respiration. We could do that by doing the same experiment, but just in a dark bottle, which restricts the amount of sunlight that can get in. So we set this up in the same illuminated, but there's no photosynthesis because the light isn't getting through. So it's using up the CO, so using up oxygen. We measure this over time, we'll see the amount of oxygen decrease, because here we're just measuring respiration. So now we can measure the amount of respiration, now net primary productivity, put them together, and it gives us an estimate of gross primary productivity. Productivity is what we're talking about here is the production at the base of the food web. And everything else is reliant on that production. And the production is driven by a variety of different factors, and it's determined by the environment, other characteristic within different environments. So this is an example in a terrestrial environment where we've got productivity here on the y-axis in two different plots. And as precipitation increases and temperature increases, we can track and plot an increase in productivity. We've talked at length about why we would see this in previous lectures. Like the amount of water that's available to plants will increase their ability to grow. And similarly, if we increase temperature, we're creating a better environment for the plant. So that can be developed from an experiment. Well, then we want to apply that to a natural system. And we see on a large spatial scales, we see the same rules playing out. So this is again another figure from the book. On the x-axis here, we've got the length of photosynthetic period. So the number of illuminated days. So we can think as we go here, it's a proxy for latitude. Here we've got the net primary productivity. And this is measured data from the field from terrestrial environments. And what we see is a nice positive correlation. Areas where we've got longer days and more sunlight, more availability of sunlight, we see higher rates of productivity. Makes sense. We can plot this out at a global scale and see the same thing. So here, darker purple, red and green intermediate. The darker purple areas are higher amounts of productivity. Green and red is lower amounts of productivity. Productivity is highest in the tropics, and close to the equator. Remember, if we plotted that up with rainfall and temperature, we get a very similar type of a heat map. We get a very similar distribution. As we move further north, either to higher latitudes or higher altitudes in some mountainous regions, we see that the productivity decreases. We've lost temperature, we've lost rainfall. That works in a terrestrial environment. We see the same type of trends in a marine environment. This is data from a paper just published by actually Kurt and some of his colleagues, Kurt Samuels and some of his colleagues. And they measured a proxy for marine productivity, looking at how productive the oceans are based on the amount of sunlight they receive, ocean temperature, nutrients, things that we can model. And they use this because there's certain chemical tracers that are characteristic of this productivity pattern. And they can search for these chemical tracers in salmon that we know migrate across this landscape. So by identifying salmon as they return to rivers in I think this was all actually from the fish that had been from the St. John River, which had been to sea for one winter or multiple sea winters, had different measurements, had different values of these chemical traces. And because we can map out what we'd expect them to be in different areas, we can then assign where we predict these fish went using this ranges in productivity. Two things. One, the first is sort of just to say that we've got this range of productivity within the oceans as well as the terrestrial environment, and that has a direct effect on the biota that are living there. So an observable effect on the biota that are living there. In an aquatic environment, light is also, and we've talked about this at length, light is also a key determinant of productivity. But it's driven not solely by latitude. It's driven by the amount of the degree to which light can penetrate the water column, the depth at which light can penetrate into the water column. And that gives us this plot here. So here we've got lake, or so we can call it ocean depth or lake depth. which correlates with the light intensity. So at the water surface, we've got 100% of the light reaches the water surface. As we go deeper, we lose 50%, 67%, 80%, 90%, 99%. And we saw that light attenuation curve in previous lectures. This means that we've got an associated pulse in productivity. The majority of it is restricted to occurring up here within the photic zone. And there's a key point here in terms of compensation depth. This is where the gross primary productivity is equal to respiration. The amount of oxygen being produced is the same as the amount of oxygen being consumed by respiration. So our NPP, our net productivity, is 0. So below that depth, sunlight is not creating any more energy. From this depth up, we're in a zone that's fueled by sunlight. From this depth down, not enough sunlight is entering to create growth, to create new energy. In an aquatic environment, it's also regulated by the availability of nutrients. Here we've got plots of summer chlorophyll versus total phosphorus. You'll see when we look at these plots, quite often what I'm talking to you about is productivity versus nutrients. But what I'm showing you isn't the same thing. We can't necessarily just go out and measure pure productivity within a lake or pure whole nutrient availability within a lake. But we've got known correlates, known things that we can observe. And here we know from a whole host of experiments that phosphorus is one of the main limiting elements, or limiting nutrients in an aquatic environment. So as you add more phosphorus, you can stimulate more plant growth, you can stimulate more productivity. Chlorophyll A is essentially it's a proxy for productivity. It's a chemical assay, and what we're doing is just measuring the amount of chlorophyll within a sample of water. From that, we can estimate the amount of phytoplankton within a sample of water. And once we've done that, we're estimating the amount of productivity. So if we take these proxies and plot out the relationship between them, we see a very strong positive correlation between phosphorus and chlorophyll levels. And this is data that has sort of been replicated countless times across the globe, and is now one of our standard measurements. I talked a bit previously about eutrophication and how the addition of excess nutrients to a system stimulates plant growth, stimulates productivity. This is the relationship that's based upon. And we can look at this in an experimental setting and say, try to assign different importances to each of these factors. So on the y-axis here, we've got standing biomass, again, another proxy for productivity, the amount of plant material within our sample under 4 different conditions in 2 different seasons. Ambient conditions, so control, say, the same experiment but with additional light added. Here, the same experiment but with additional nutrients added. So light remains the same, but we've just added nutrients. Here, nutrients remain the same, we've just added light. And here we've added both. So you can see that there's a cumulative effect as you add more light and also add more nutrients. The two of those, the interaction between those two is greater than the sum of their parts. The interaction between those two stimulates additional growth. What I've been talking about so far in terms of trends in productivity are quite universal. But when we try to bring this down to a system that we're interested in, or even a habitat that we're interested in, those that smaller spatial scale will have multiple sources of energy, or multiple sources of carbon. We could think of, and when we pool these as autochthonous carbon, which is any carbon that is derived within the system. Alloctonous is any organic carbon that comes in from a different source. And the relative importance of these differs between different seasons or different habitats, and also between different seasons. It's determined by the characteristics of the environment. Well, what we see in terms of a alloctonous, autochthonous energy entering a river is very different to a marine environment or a pond/small lake. In the marine environment, what do you think? Is the majority of energy, the majority of carbon synthesized within the system, or does it come from somewhere else? Yeah. It's synthesized, it's autochthonous, it's synthesized within the system. It's synthesized by phytoplankton from CO2, from carbon dioxide within the water column. They're synthesizing their organic materials from that CO2. That phytoplankton is then a resource for zooplankton, is then a resource for pelagic fish. Some of it drifts down to the seabed, where it's a resource for benthic invertebrates, for filter feeders. It's all fueled by sunlight hitting the water, stimulating photosynthesis by the phytoplankton. If we go to a river environment, it's quite different. And even within a single river, it can be very different. And this is was really nicely summarized, or sort of first laid out by another Canadian ecologist, by Vanot et al., in what they termed as the river continuum concept. And what Vanot and colleagues basically showed, or first hypothesized and then showed, is that if you have a river system and it starts in the headwaters, or a small stream moving through a forest, it's got very, so if you're, let's hypothetically, the results probably are. Okay. So if you start with a small stream in a forest, is that the majority of that, the energy fueling that food web, fueling the community within that stream, is that alloctonous or autochthonous? Alloctonous? What do you say alloctonous? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, okay. So that's alloctonous. So see, energy is coming in from the trees, and we'll see when you look at that area that the majority of invertebrates are shredded, and invertebrates that can chop and break down that coarse terrestrial matter. As you move further downstream, the river opens up. It's not covered in trees anymore. It receives more sunlight. There's still nutrients in the water column because it's sort of what it's gained from further up. Stimulates plankton growth, stimulates more autochthonous production within the stream. So even within a river, we can see a balance, a trade-off between those two. Some research, sort of even research that I'm doing at the moment, is trying to understand this balance in the context of seasonal variation. What happens if you cover this river with ice for 2 months out of the year? How will that change? How will that reflect or affect the food web structure and the resources fueling the community? Lakes can be a lot more interesting, or are very interesting and a lot more complicated. Because they're dependent, it's determined on the environment around them, the morphology of the lake, and even the purity and size of the lake. A large open water lake is predominantly fueled by autochthonous production. But smaller ponds or smaller lakes have a lot more allochthonous energy. It's also determined by resource use or land use around the lake. If you've got an area within intensive agriculture or intensive forestry, you've got a lot more runoff, a lot more nutrients from outside this lake system coming into the lake, into the water body. Even the net primary productivity will vary over time on a short scale or on a longer term scales. So here we're looking at net primary productivity in lakes and how that varies through the seasons. This is an example. So this is one of the systems that I used to work on back in the day. It's Lake Kilpisjärvi, way up in the north of Finland. And this is us, well, it's not me, but it could have been me, traversing that lake in the depths of winter. And that's the same lake in the middle of summer. Two very, very different environments. All the pelagic productivity, all the autotrophic production occurs during that brief window of a couple of months in the summer. What we see in the fishes, so that we get phytoplankton bloom fed on by zooplankton, and because of the type of production it is, it's rich in essential fatty acids. It's rich in omega-3 and omega-6s and DHAs, things that these fish need are very good for developing their gonads. So even though these fish, the majority of one fish species is a dominant species in that lake, it's predominantly a benthivore. It spends most of its time feeding on the benthos. But in late summer, when we get this boom in pelagic productivity, it moves up and feeds on zooplankton. And at that time, it transfers most of that energy into developing its gonad. So this one brief summer blast of pelagic productivity, the system, or the species there have adapted their life history to maximize the benefit of that. Again, fueling or bettering their reproductive output, improving the reproductive output, maximizing the reproductive output. That's sort of an annual or intra-annual trend. Very concept. We also see longer-term data series, or if we look at a longer-term data series, we can see the same patterns play out. This is data from a long-term study at Rohanstead, which is a research lab in the UK. And what we've got is two plots here. We're looking at summer hay yield. So essentially the amount of grass that grew in their series of study fields in the summer. You can see that this is sort of varies quite a bit year on year. There's a lot of interannual variability. Now here we look at mean temperature values for the same years. And we see a alternative relationship. When this is low, productivity is low, coincides with temperature being high. Temperature is not so high, productivity is quite high. At a longer term cycle, over a multi-year cycle, we're seeing trends in productivity are driven by the availability of water and the actual temperature and the availability of nutrients. So these things cycle at a short scale and also at a longer scale. And this is crucially important, particularly when we're thinking in terms of food webs, because the amount of energy and the amount of carbon that gets absorbed into a secondary consumer or primary consumer is directly related to the amount of energy that's produced and available from its primary producers. And we can think of this as, there's two sort of separate ways we can look at this. There's a constant trade-off between production and consumers. more growth we have, more primary production we have, that can create more food for consumers. If we've got like one of those nice summers in Roehampton, where it's only moderately warm, plenty of rainfall, we've got a lot of grass growing, it's a perfect environment for cattle, and lots of cows, everything's going well. A system where if we have a very dry summer, there's less grass growing, less resources available for the consumers. We turn that as a bottom-up production, bottom-up energy flow through the system. You can also think of this as a top-down perspective. So if we've got lots and lots of cattle, they'll overgraze the primary producers, restricting the amount or the amount of production that can be performed in any one season. Some of the nicest examples of this come from an aquatic food web. And we can sort of think of this as very straightforward aquatic food chain. You start off with phytoplankton, they're fed on by zooplankton, which in turn are fed on by these planktivorous fish, which in turn are fed on by piscivorous fish. We can look at this, we can sort of do hypothetical studies, hypothetical tests, or we can actually take some data and see what would happen if we, first of all, we increased pelagic productivity. If we increase pelagic productivity, we can get more phytoplankton, fuels more zooplankton, it increases at each stage of the food web. Conversely, we can say, okay, well, what happens if we were to modify this ecosystem? If we take out the top predator. So when we take out the top predator, what we're doing is we're reducing that top-down pressure down through the food chain. So we take out the top predator, that increases the abundance of planktivorous fishes. There's fewer predators, there's less predatory pressure on them, their abundance increases, so that our predation pressure on the zooplankton increases, the abundance of zooplankton therefore decreases, and this cascades down the food chain where eventually you get to the base and the amount of phytoplankton increases because there's fewer predators, fewer direct predators on the food chain. So we term this as a trophic cascade. And it's an interplay between the ideas of bottom-up and versus top-down regulation within a food web. I've mostly talked about, almost entirely talked about what we term the grazing food chain, where herbivores feed on primary producers. There's a secondary detrital food chain, which will come in and talk more about in subsequent lectures or subsequent courses. It's crucially important, but for the moment, just be aware of it. And it's crucially important because it fuels either certain habitats or certain seasons when primary production, phototrophy, is restricted, is limited. And so then we see this detrital food chain increasing in importance. The last thing I want to talk about is the relationship between energy and biomass across the food chain. Typically, so as in second law of thermodynamics, and as we talk about entropy, with each trophic step in a food chain, we're losing a large proportion of the energy. Consumers and animals are incredibly inefficient. We only gain or we only use about 10% of the energy in the food and the trophic level below it. So if you have a set of primary producers and look at the primary consumers, by mass, they'll be far, far smaller. Oh, they'll be only 10%, or you've lost 90%. Overall, but if you look at that over a shorter time window, you won't necessarily see the same thing. Longer term, you see this nice pyramid. In the shorter term, that can be almost reversed. So here we've got primary producers, far more primary consumers than primary producers, and again fewer secondary consumers. And what we're seeing here is a correlation or an effect of different turnover rates, life cycle rates associated with different trophic levels. So here, at any one time, there's not as many primary producers because they're constantly being consumed. But as they're being consumed, they're regenerating and new ones are growing. So at one time, you get this type of a relationship. There can be a lower biomass of primary producers than there are of primary consumers. But always, as we look at this over a longer term, that process will reverse. In the lake food web, we can sort of see this when we talk about zooplankton and phytoplankton. Typically, the biomass of zooplankton will be much higher than the biomass of phytoplankton within the lake. Solely because the phytoplankton are able to regenerate so quickly that the zooplankton can continue to graze down on those primary producers. I'm going to leave it at that for now. Quick summary. So energy, fuel, and food webs follows the same laws of physics. Primary productivity determines it's determined by light and nutrient availability. Food webs can be fueled by allogenous and autochthonous sources. And with transfer of primary production to secondary production happens through a lot of